is probably longer than many of the people I'm talking to now.
Yeah.
But, yeah, so I've just sort of picked out a few things. I've been working on this for nearly 3 years now, and I've picked out a few things, mostly from the beginning of my PhD, just to sort of give you a bit of an idea about what it's like. And I hope that they're not too sort of dumb for master's students, because these are all PowerPoint presentations I did for very interdisciplinary groups. I started my PhD in the Department of History, Anthropology, Politics, and Philosophy. So some of it's just very basic architectural principles that they wouldn't get otherwise. But anyway, I'll stop going on, and I'll just kind of get straight into it. And I've also got, yeah, my first year or my second year differentiation report. So because it explains overall what I've been trying to do. I haven't been teaching since February either, and I don't know how to share a PowerPoint on.
Okay.
Sorry.
So have you got your PowerPoint open on your desktop or your laptop?
I can do that now.
Yeah. So if you do that.
Where is it now? I thought I was opening it, just a bit slow.
Never mind.
I think I need to drag and drop it from the. Oh no, there it is.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the first one.
Okay, then you go to you drag your cursor to the bottom of the Zoom, and it says share screen.
Oh yes, yes.
Press on share screen.
Yeah.
And then you will see your PowerPoint, and you just click on that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So this was an anthropology seminar. It's quite good coming from architecture into other disciplines. They're always really fascinated with what we do. So
not seeing it yet. Not seeing.
Oh, you're not seeing it. Apologies. Share. Yes. Okay. I missed a step.
Perfect.
Can you see it now?
Perfect. Brilliant.
Yeah. So this was a seminar that I did the very first week I started the PhD, and it was about using hybrid methodologies. So how to use architectural drawing, photography, and anthropology, participant observation as a research methodology. And I'd also shown this actually in Cambridge just before I started in Queen's. And so this is kind of an example. You know, I started a lot of this sort of stuff in Berlin and in other contested cities. So Nicosia, it sounds like I've been on a similar trajectory to yourselves, Nick. So I was looking at divided cities a lot, actually, over the last 20 years since I saw you last. And this is an example of how you could map sort of how a space is appropriated by a water cellar. This one is in Naples, actually. It wasn't one of my students that did this, but they started off by photographing this sort of closed water cellar's shop at the top, and then bit by bit how he moves bits out of the shop to appropriate space around it, and then eventually retracts back and closes up. So this course that this student was taking was actually urban anthropology, which is a thing I was connected with in Berlin in the early 2000s. I was asked to do a video of the Berlin Wall. So I'll get to Belfast because I keep starting off with Berlin. But how you document an existing urban process. So I then set my own students a project to document small acts of rebellion and public moments of negotiation. This would be an example of a small act of rebellion and a public moment of negotiation. So very much about the everyday architecture. And so when my students from Oxford Brookes, actually, a long time ago, went to Berlin, this is some second year undergraduates, they noticed some bullet holes, actually, in the railway bridge that was on the border between East and West Berlin, and they mapped the trajectories of the bullets. And then they sort of set up a little installation where those bullet trajectories were illuminated to reveal these invisible processes. So I'm always looking to reveal invisible processes through these kind of architectural investigations or these architectural recordings. They also had some music involved with this thing as well. The music would travel across from the east to the west. But the key thing here for me was that it was a hospital. And actually, this particular idea of drawing the bullet holes and mapping the trajectories got me out of a bit of a sticky situation in Belfast, because I was not. It's the difficult thing with my PhD is what I'm doing is I'm looking at British Army observation posts, but they've all been removed. And so there's very much, they never existed officially in some ways. So sometimes I'm using these bullet holes as to prove that they actually did exist, and that's what's happened to me with the Royal Victoria Hospital. Nobody was believing that there was ever a British Army observation post there. I'm looking at covert Army observation posts, and so the only way I could prove it was actually by doing what these second-year students in Oxford did like 15 years ago, where they mapped the bullet holes. So that was quite interesting. This is another kind of thing in Berlin. I'll move quickly through this and try and get to Belfast. So that's just mapping the movements of dough around a bakery shop. But in Belfast, there are first year students, undergraduate students, doing this kind of thing, and they call it spatial biography. So you're looking at the recipe of how you would make a loaf of bread, but you're moving the bread around from one part of the bakery shop to the other. And so this is just my proposal for how I would then go ahead and use these processes to map the plans and sections of all these invisible covert operations. Also then the idea that you could use architectural drawing as a historical reconstruction of dynamic warfare. So this is some students in Nicosia, again mapping bullet holes actually, I'm afraid, because there's a lot of mud buildings along here. So they were mapping the bullet holes from the Greek army observation post, and this at the Paphos gate. So they're mapping all the trajectory. Sorry, this is very pixelated. And then this is in Dunkirk, where the students, for some reasons, all girls that get obsessed with this stuff. But this is a young female student from England who was mapping the movement of tanks, panzer tanks, and airplanes and parachutists. She basically spent a week or something in the archive in Dunkirk, in the local history archive of this particular site, which was a 19th century barracks, and mapping all of the accumulated dynamics of the warfare that had taken place on that site, but then also the viewing trajectories, as you can see down here, of all the observation posts looking out towards the sea. So I was hoping to be able to get all this kind of information in Belfast, but you might be finding, as I have been finding since I've been working on Belfast, that a lot of the stuff in archives is just, inaccessible. Things are, archive material is heavily redacted. Which in itself is very interesting. Why is it all so hard to find? It's very easy to find out stuff about the Nazis and all the terrible things they did. But it's very hard to find out actually about, when someone hasn't lost the war, if you like, it's harder to find out. So I found in Berlin it was actually very difficult. And even though the East Germans did lose the war, if you like, it was still very difficult to find stuff because they had shredders and I don't know. I'll stop rambling on and try and get to Belfast. That's Nicosia again, sort of mapping trajectories of bullet holes. And that's the observation post there. Yeah, right. I'll get on to. So this is just something that has also influenced me is Bernard Tschumy's description of states of decay and modernist architecture in decay. Which I think is quite interesting. So transgressing the limits that history has set for it, etc. I'm going to move on. This one actually kind of shocked them. I think to really appreciate architecture, you may even need to commit a murder. And may I say here, I'm absolutely pacifist. It's, I'm not suggesting anything like that. It's just that what Tschumi was trying to argue here was that architecture is activated by the events that it witnesses. And so, if somebody does get killed in a building, that's more important actually than what sort of decorative facade it might have, etc. So that's the angle. Again, I'll move through that quickly. Yeah, situationist tactics. It's always useful. I'm sure you know all about this stuff, so I won't. But this guy here, if you're interested in looking at conflict architecture, you could do worse than take a look at some of these military architectural drawings from the Encyclopedia of Military Architecture. I'm desperately trying to remember the name of the author, Viollet-le-Duc. There he is, and he was obsessed with medieval architecture, but he's mapping here the movement of troops across into above a kind of defensive wall and into a castle. So a whole series of events, the kind of thing Bernard Toomey, I suppose, is looking for, is how is the architecture activated by the events that it's witnessing? And you have fire coming out here of the turrets and so on. You have to look this up on the French version of Wikipedia. I think it's called Wikisource, and you can get there's loads of brilliant drawings about defensive architecture if this is the kind of thing you're interested in. And you can see all these various different tactics and strategies being prepared along the way. I'd love to be able to show you drawings like this that I've done of Belfast, but I haven't done them yet. So I thought I might as well show you what I'm aiming for instead. And this is the kind of, in Paris again, how the various different city walls were sequentially built and extended further and further out for defensive purposes to protect these kind of palaces and things. And again, Viollet-le-Duc is looking at the adaptation of these. There's quite a few of these in Nicosia, actually. How these, I've forgotten what they're called now, battlements, escarpments, and so on. How they're adapted over time in response to different kinds of ability to view the soldiers arriving. You know, the attacking soldiers arriving. How you could actually, on the one hand, there's viewing, and on the other hand, there is shooting and, you know, attacking and so on. So there's a kind of a linkage happening between the viewing trajectories and the shooting trajectories, and I'm finding a lot of that is the same, whether it's Berlin or Belfast or Nicosia. We are getting gun slots that are never mentioned on the official documents. So there's one down here. I think that's a hidden sort of cannon firing spot. These are all the cannon firing spots, but you get a lot of this kind of thing. Of course, it never happened. It gets written out of history, except in the case of these medieval battlements, which is quite interesting. But there you can see the kind of conflict in full swing, and you can see the two sides shooting against each other. At the moment, I'm in the process of collecting narratives about this kind of stuff. So I'm reading the soldiers. I'm reading a lot of the soldiers' oral histories because I can't go and interview them, but I've collected a lot of oral histories from people in Belfast. My year of study is 1972, so you know people are quite old. They're in their 80s. The people who were kind of, so I thought it was very important to do this before they're gone, because there are, as I said, very few records of what was going on. Here we have a tortoise, I think it's called. This is a sort of defensive structure that was used again in the Middle Ages, and someone sneakily digging under the battlements there. So anyway, I keep saying I'll get to Belfast, but that's my kind of intention. I was going to use psychogeography. Yeah, didn't do that in the end. That didn't go down so well with the history and the politics people. So I'll get to a Belfast one now. Let's see, what's this one? Well, no, I'll tell you what. I will start with just explaining the idea of my PhD, which I haven't really said much about. So I was interested in the shift from overt to covert observation in Belfast, and it seems to have happened around 1972 in terms of, you know, you saw these very visible observation posts suddenly disappeared, and you know, you'd just get a brick removed from the edge of a building and, you know, from the attic, and that would be where the soldiers were. I found lots of articles about soldiers hiding in a fish and chip shop, and soldiers hiding, you know, in the attic of the fish and chip shop for weeks on end without anybody knowing, or soldiers hiding in a massage parlor, you know, British spies found in massage parlor. There's some brilliant articles. So, but I was interested in that shift between the visible to the invisible, and whether that might be something that we could consider to be a postmodern moment. As you will know, presumably from your history and theory course, you know, the demolition of Pruitt-Igoe flats in St. Louis, Missouri happened in 1972. There's a specific date, I think it's, you know, 25th of August or something, 1972, when this particular block of flats was demolished. And that is supposed to be the first, the beginning of postmodernism. I thought, yes, St. Louis, Missouri, maybe, but surely the Berlin Wall was a bigger one, or perhaps, you know, even the conflict in Belfast might be part of that same kind of wave, if you like, that we were seeing in St. Louis, Missouri. Um, so, you know, I tried to theorize, because it's not that easy to find really specific theories of postmodernism. You know, what does it mean for something to be postmodern? And I asked a few, again, very interdisciplinary. I asked a few different artists and fashion designers. I was running the architecture course, and I used to sit around the table with these course leaders from other disciplines. And the fine artists said, well, you know, the best example of postmodern artifact would be the erased de Kooning drawing by Robert Rauschenberg. And the reason why it's considered to be postmodern is that, on the one hand, he's appropriating the work of another artist. On the other hand, it's a subversion of the act of drawing, because he's actually not drawing, he's removing. So those two criteria were key. There's a whole load of other criteria, but appropriation and subversion and invisibility, these are the kind of three key aspects. There seems to be something about destruction as well in there, demolition, destruction, etc. But yeah, it's also considered to be a symbolically patricidal gesture. And I thought, that's interesting, because a younger artist is erasing the older artist's work. So that's interesting, this idea of something younger emerging from some older established way of doing things. So the rejection of traditional practices. So I then took those, these are more examples of appropriations and subversions. I think I'll skip the rest of this now. Let's see. Okay, so these are my, what I've done here then is I've established maybe 12 different criteria for postmodernism. Nostalgia, use of historical precedents, pastiche, consumerism, commodification, mixing of genres, signs and iconography. Now that's an interesting one, and I was thinking about things like the murals, and Venturi, Scott Brown go into this a lot. How the urban space in Las Vegas is populated by ducks and decorated sheds. I'll come back to that. But these key things: appropriation, subversion, signs, simulations. And of course, now I've been getting into simulated Northern Ireland's, because you've got a place in Kent called Tin City, where the troops used to go to train. There's actually a lot of different places where they used to go to train for Northern Ireland, because it was considered at the time, from well after 72 right through till 1998, which was when the peace agreement was, or right until 1994, the ceasefire. It was considered to be actually one of the most dangerous theatre of war for a British soldier to go to. Yeah, so these are the kinds of things here, you know, that I've been looking at. And again, massive topics: spectacles, mass media, off-world colonies. Anyway, I've then looked at, you know, modernist architecture, and how some modernist architecture actually was already quite postmodern at that point, at that turning point around about 72. So this is the Cubist kitchen. So, you know, we've got things like Corbusian modernism being appropriated for a suburban house on the east coast of America. And in a way, then you could say that this is some sort of mixing of genres, but also a kind of an affectation of style, if you like. So I started to realize that I used to work in Richard Meyer's office before I met Nick Boyarsky. Actually, I worked there for a couple of years. And I used to be hugely disappointed that it wasn't as modern as I expected it to be, but I realized a lot of the architecture was about subverting these rules and, you know, adapting them to the context. So you got these kind of wiggly bits in the project which responded to the movement of the river, and all sorts of contextual things that were happening in architectural culture at the time were being appropriated into the modernist sort of palette, if you like. So yeah, and these different colors were all about context and relating to context. So, you know, I used to teach a theory course in Norwich, where students were asked to prove any particular project, kind of test any particular project through a theory. So the idea is that you could take a project like the Snyderman House, which is the one I was just showing you by Michael Graves, and and sort of just show how postmodern it is, even though it looks like it's a modernist project. So you take things like signs and iconography, semiotics, linguistics, all of these 12 criteria that you've developed for what do you mean by postmodernism. Yeah, these are the 12 criteria. I'm going to map them against particular elements of the project to prove that it's postmodern type of thing. So this idea of the double reading is an aspect of postmodernism. I'm probably getting too theoretical here, but anyway, I think I'll move on from this one. So that's all about postmodernism and appropriation and subversion. Let's see. So here we get into Belfast. A comparative study, this is what I propose to do, a comparative study of Belfast walls and the Berlin Wall seen through the lens of postmodern theory. This PhD thesis explores a range of interconnected themes in which the evolution of separation walls in these divided cities is chronologically considered. Starting from their intended role as instruments of spatial separation, I then explore their part in sequentially distancing the polarized territories of these fragmented cities. I go on to consider their unintended role in instigating subversive social interactions and events. The treatment of both sets of walls as a form of media communication is considered through the lens of postmodern theory. So that's the Berlin version where you have all these kind of signs. I'm not going to go into this too much, but yeah, I'm using my 12 criteria there to show how these walls embody appropriations of spatial, social, and cultural territories, how they enlist practices of subversion, how they articulate related political contexts, how they enact historical reinventions of cultural heritage, how they perform languages of dissent, how they enlist politics of resistance, how they conjure rituals and traditions, and how they emphasize the value of place. Now, I was told by the politics people and the anthropology people, you are crazy. There's no way in hell you can compare the walls in Berlin with the walls in Belfast. You know, different politics, different people, etc., etc. It's way too large of a project for a PhD. But I know that as architectural designers and as sort of architectural tutors, that's not such a big project, really. It's the kind of thing tutors set as a project quite a lot for their students, and you need lots of different angles on something. Sorry, I'm rabbiting on a bit here. But so, you know, I think traces of that are still there, but I've actually boiled mine down, my project down so much that I'm only doing 1972. I'm only doing observation posts. I'm not doing the walls at all. But anyway, what you get on these different sort of divided cities, you'll find is that there's always an homage to Picasso's Guernica as a way of talking about the conflict through another means. And of course, there is a Belfast one, which I hope I've got here. Here we have an appropriation of Andy Warhol. You probably have seen this one already, but it came as a shock to me to discover that these are all the hunger strikers. And so we're supposed to find them as cheerful and jolly as, you know, JFK or Marilyn Monroe or, you know, Jackie Kennedy or any of the people that Warhol used to do these sort of repeat images of. And I actually found, I had to laugh when I saw, I didn't actually recognize any of the hunger strikers. I didn't even know what Bobby Sands looked like when I went to Belfast, but I thought this was actually really a good sense of postmodern sense of humor, if you like. And what you also get here are these, oops, sorry, what have I done? References to geographically distant places. And if you've been there already, you wonder, what on earth are they doing, putting this imagery of Cuba on a wall in Belfast. This is a dividing line. Sorry, this is the international wall. It's a dividing line between the predominantly Catholic area and the predominantly Protestant area. It's the kind of most well-known historic battleground, if you like, the Shankill Falls Divide, it's called, and that's my site. Again, I wasn't allowed to do all of Belfast. I had to restrict it right down to about 500 meters by 500 meters. I actually ended up doing, you know, going beyond that slightly, but you know, East Belfast for the anthropologists, totally different kettle of fish to West Belfast. So we're in West Belfast here. And so what I started, you know, following the anthropological advice I was getting, what I started to do was to just categorize. And I wish I could show you some beautiful architectural drawings of this, but I'll just have to wing it in terms of my words, because I don't have any beautiful architectural drawings of this. Where, you know, on the Catholic side, they were talking about the conflict by talking about other places. So, you know, I got the sense from talking to people as well that there was that the IRA was a communist outfit, if you like, a group of kind of communists. Even my mum, my mum is American actually. My mum said, "Oh yeah, when we arrived in Ireland in 1968, we thought there was a, you know, 1969. I said, what did you think was going on with the conflict up there? And she said, well, we thought a bunch of communists had taken over Belfast. So that was something that I hadn't considered before. Anyway, you know, so Cuba, of course, is going to be this destination, this place that they will idealize. But there are a lot of geographical affiliations being declared on the international wall with other places, distance and place and time. So on the Catholic side, you will see affiliations with the Palestinians and oppression. You'll see affiliations with the Cubans. You'll see affiliations being declared with the Basque separatists. You'll see affiliations being declared with if you see an Israeli flag, you know that you're in the Protestant area, because, you know, there is then this reciprocal affiliation that's being declared by the Protestant loyalists. I'm talking about working class communities, so you don't really see this in the middle class areas, but in the working class communities, you will see Israeli flags to remind you that you're in a Protestant area. You'll see Palestinian flags to remind you you're in a Catholic area. It took me a while to understand the semiotics and the signs that were being. You probably already know about this, but it took me a while to pick it up. Anyway, so this polarized semiotics of territory, history, and place. It's very much on the Catholic side. The affiliations are geographical, and they are to do with postmodern geographies, if you like. And it's all about, you know, media, dominant ideologies, media consumption, and how these sort of this media imagery is being presented to tourists. And I compare it as well a little bit to this idea of the Roman Forum, where, you know, not such successful battles are being described within the architecture. I know this is slightly more beautiful than the Hunger Strikers mural, but, you know, some very unsuccessful battles are being described carved into the stone. And it's the narrative purpose there of the architecture that's of interest. And so this is why I began to think about these murals as ducks, which is in Venturi Scott Brown's terminology, it's a semiotic. Well, I'll get into that in a second. Here you can see the Palestine. So here we have the affiliations with Palestine. So here I am. What I've done there is I've started mapping all of these different aspects of postmodernism: appropriation, subversion, politics of resistance, collage, montage, pop art origins, etc. I've mapped them against the artifacts that I found interesting. That, you know, Catalan markings. There was quite a lot of stuff. There's a Che Guevara mural. So I find if you map the Che Guevara mural against the politics of resistance and against remote cultures and geographies, for example, you can see that there's something to be written about there. So my project is all about writing, really, more so than drawing at the moment. If you map the interface walls against the Venturi ducks symbolic architecture, you might find that the interface gates similarly are like ducks in that they embody the symbolic meaning of the walls, and the gates far outweighs their functional purpose. So, you know, that's quite interesting. And so, you know, everything I'm doing is really about trying to prove that this stuff is postmodern. The decorated shed, on the other hand, I think is where you get murals painted on the side of a house, you know. so that the sign is there, but it's kind of much larger than the perfunctory function of the structure on which it's inscribed. So, you've got all these, also this idea of meta-narratives and opposition to meta-narratives, where there's a lot of meta-narratives going on here. Now, by contrast, on the Protestant side, what you will find is a lot of stuff about history, about heritage, about identity, I suppose, when you get identity on both sides, to be fair. But lots of stuff about, you'll see all these murals of King Billy on his horse. And you'll see stuff about, as my supervisor said, well, now the Battle of the Boyne is beginning to be superseded by the Battle of the Somme. So it's all about the Battle of the Somme, in recent years, since I've been there. So you'll see poppies and World War II memorabilia appearing all over the walls on the Protestant side. And gradually King Billy is sort of disappearing. He's even been removed from Prince Charles's castle. You have to go, if you get a chance to go to Prince Charles's castle, it'd be great. And, Martin McGuinness is visible there. He's in a little photograph. So apparently they've spent a lot of time debating this. There's a lot of sensitivity over these images and how they relate to the architecture. So here we have some more kind of mappings where I took the theoretical elements, let's say, of Soya's postmodern geographies, the spatial turn. What Soya was interested in was this moment where we were talking about late 80s, where people started to look at the spaces and how spaces related to each other rather than necessarily the history of things. So instead of treating culture as a kind of sequence of events that happened one after the other, Soya was more interested in the spatial relationships between one thing and another, and what that might tell us. And I suppose this is where we are in a fantastic position as architecture students or as architects. We're in a great position to be able to do that with a certain, equipped with a certain amount of tools that, historians just don't have, I suppose. So, other kinds of mappings which are useful if you're doing a theoretical study on this kind of thing would be to do a discourse analysis. Read up some literature. You're doing a literature review. You're reading up literature on interface walls, let's say, or whatever your topic is. Find out as much as you can about it, and then think about, well, how would I write this in relation to post-colonialism? How would I write this in relation to postmodernism or gender or structuralism? Or, that's me trying to map which are the most appropriate theories for me to think about this particular study. Obviously way too big. And I've ended up actually doing a lot more on post-colonialism and gender than on postmodernism in the end. So another thing you could do is, as you're reading stuff, and I would highly recommend that you just write a little paragraph about anything you've read. And then what you can do is you can map each of these essays that you've read. If this is me reading about walls. So every interface wall I read about, I would then map that author's work, I date it, and then map it against these theories. So I'm kind of analysing it through my 14 criteria that I started with as I go along. So I've just read something by Johnny Byrne, let's say, about interface walls in East Belfast, and it's about youngsters, being given youngsters being given mobile phones either side of a dividing wall, and how that's used by teenagers as a way to, pacify all of the conflict that was happening across that wall. Well, what does that tell me? It's about this kind of something about anti-functionalist urbanism, something in there about Deleuze-Fold spatial slippage, because they had these wall guardians that would move from one side to the other. And also, things that we wouldn't consider at all important, but they're super important at that time. We're talking about 2002, 2005, would be things like knowing somebody else's license plate number and communicating that to somebody else. So connecting people with cars is a big issue. Anyway, I'm still not quite with the program in terms of you've got to be very discreet if you're living in one of these so-called areas. You've got to be very discreet about who you say things to. Of course, a lot of the stuff I'm reading is really historical, so I don't, you probably don't need to be so concerned. But the stuff I'm reading is often way back in '72 or even more recently than that. So it's not the same. It's a much friendlier place these days than what I'm describing. Sorry, I'm rambling on again. So Charles Jenks, all that kind of stuff. I was talking about the Pruitt-Igoe flats in Missouri. So that's the moment. That's supposed to be the postmodern moment. There were some racial issues in there, so I think there's definitely something to be said about that moment being postmodern. But I suspect it was just a hint of something much bigger, and I'm beginning to come around to thinking that it is to do with race and space, and it is to do with post-colonialism, and it is to do with gender, and it is to do with 1968. All this is happening after the Summer of Love in 1968, 1969. There are civil rights movements all over the world, student revolts, etc. So there is something changing, and yeah, I'm going off the top. I haven't even shown you a photograph of an observation post yet, so I think I'll escape this highly theoretical one. Right, so here we have, oops, let's see if I can open this. No, is that the right one? I'm going to do Berlin again. No, I'll skip that one. I'll go straight to this one here. Okay, so here we have, can you see that all right?
Yeah, Reenie, it's fine. We can see it. We're all with you.
Okay, sorry. So here we have a first observation post that I started to look at, and I didn't know it was on the Springfield Road. I didn't know anything about it. What I found is every time I found these, I'd find them online. I would go. My process was I'd go into this place called the Nationalist Republican History Museum, because most of them, of course, were on the Catholic side. There was very few on the Protestant side, and that in itself took me a year to find out. I would walk around my little patch of half a mile by half a mile, asking people, were there any British observation posts around here, and where was this one, where was that one? They'd give me addresses, they'd give me corners, they'd give me street names, and then I'd look online for them. I would try and find out about them in archives. I would try and find out about them in museums. I'd go to libraries. This one, actually, the internet was great. So, don't worry about not being able to go there so much in a way at the moment. The internet was very useful. And when I looked up this particular one, I ended up mapping it with one I'd found out. Sometimes you'll find an image, you don't know where it is. Other times you'll be told there was an observation post in such and such a place, but you're not quite sure what it looked like. So I finally matched up this image with the observation post that I'd heard about. And maybe I should read something about this to you. So I'm assessing detailed elements of construction as technologies of adaptation and challenging the deterministic attitude to technological development that underpinned functionalism. The functionalist doctrine held that through the rational refinement in the functioning of detailed spatial elements, the performance of the whole construction would be enhanced. Improvement lay in the gradual elimination of problematic functions, whilst development would naturally result from perfecting certain processes and technological minutiae, thus extending life expectancy in an architectural mirroring of Darwinism. If the functionalist doctrine is valid, then each strategic shift in the observation positions over time should demonstrate an improvement. Incremental adaptations in the detailed functioning of the architecture should demonstrate progress. If the functionalist doctrine is found to be valid, then functionalism is proved to be valid. If it's found to be invalid, then functionalism is challenged. Sorry, I don't know what on earth that sentence means. The experiment will test how buildings learn in an urban vision of the pedagogical process outlined by Stuart Brand in The Tradition of Darwin, applied to a social science of architectural adaptation. In the case that buildings are found not to learn, I can challenge the value of applying Darwin's theory to a social science of architecture. So this is photograph 1, 1969 to 72, and I'm trying to do a kind of forensic content analysis of the photograph. I find it on a Google Maps search. As the photograph is not dated, I search for clues to identify when and exactly where on the Springfield Road it was taken. The cars on the street look very 1960s. The style of the prams, the man's suit, the woman's knee-length socks, and the woman's hooded anorak also look very 60s. So I'm talking about these things. These little details down here gave me a bit of a clue. In this photo, the soldier's head and face are unprotected. His stance is fairly relaxed, and he's not wearing riot gear or looking through the sights of a rifle. So I deduce that the photograph must be early on in the Troubles. The British Army entered Belfast in August 1969, so I reckon it must be shortly after that. In the title, we are told that the occupant is a soldier from the 2nd Parachute Regiment, one of the 8 British Army regiments posted in West Belfast during the Troubles. I now look at the architecture for more clues to the date and location. The structure is a rudimentary timber-framed construction with inward sloping columns and overhanging roof. A thin layer of profiled metal cladding sits on top of the cantilevered roof beams. Sandbags provide protection to the sides of the structure. They do not protect the soldier's torso. A flagpole behind it is rigged with a rope. And that was my clue, actually. That's where I began to work it out. I deduced that the flying of a Union Jack flag would have taken place here regularly, suggesting that the building was an institution of the state. And again, we're talking about semiotics and space. My supervisor has actually spent his entire career just looking at flags. This suggests that the building was an institution of the state, and it allows me to date the building to before the introduction of direct rule in March 1972. Now, in March 1972, power was removed from Stormont. You'll have heard about the Parliament buildings in Stormont. Power was removed from Stormont and was taken over by Westminster. So that's what they call direct rule. So this was before March 1972. The parapet in the photograph is low and the roof is flat, indicating a modern building. I seek assistance in locating the exact position of the observation post from a series of people in the area. A historian informs me that there was an RUC station on Springfield Road at Violet Street. Now this is a historian. It was a person who, in my day, because I grew up in Ireland in the south where there was very little conflict, but I grew up here in the 1960s. So we arrived just before the conflict began. So we arrived here in 1966. And I grew up here, left in around about 86. But in those days, this person would not have been called a historian. But everybody who was involved in the conflict basically is nowadays either a social worker or a historian. Anyway, they informed me that there was an RUC station on Springfield Road at Violet Street. The urban context of the street in the photograph fits the geometry of the map in this location. This view is confirmed by a former RUC officer I meet, who takes me on a tour of her former area of investigation. It's actually, I'm trying to conceal the identity. It wasn't a woman at all. But, you know, again, in my day, there's no way in hell you'd have been able to do that. There's no way you'd have been able to be seen to know an RUC officer. You could have been shot just for speaking to an RUC officer, driving around a car with them in the Shankill Falls Divide. That just wouldn't have happened. Anyway, she was on the murder squad, it turns out. He was on the murder squad. Takes me around her former area of investigation. She drives me around and mentions that an RUC station on the Springfield Road that has now been demolished and replaced by housing. Equipped with a program, I now embark on another Google adventure, and I discover photographs 2 and 3. All right, so let's see. Yeah, and it was illegal, actually, for Catholic photographers. It was illegal for anyone to take photographs of observation posts because it's in breach of the Official Secrets Act. So a lot of these things, if you worked for the Belfast Telegraph, I think they were the only media, the only newspaper that was allowed to take photographs of them. All the photographers I spoke to, I had a really good contacts in the Catholic newspaper. But they were never allowed to have them in their photographs. Only the people who worked for the Protestant newspaper were allowed to photograph them, because they were a target. So you could have them sort of appearing in the back of a riot scene or something like that, or, you know, a protest or whatever, but you couldn't actually take a photograph of them like this. So I knew, you can see there, Victor Patterson, I could tell that from the name that he was a Protestant and not a Catholic. And that's why I've slapped that on there, that even me showing this could probably, you know, be really bad. I don't know. This map, I do have permission to show this map. And this is what the librarian insisted I show it at everything I go to, every event I present at, because she calls it the sectarian map of Belfast. And you can see the little green area. This is around about 1976. The green area is Catholic, and all the rest of it is different degrees of Protestant, apparently. That's changed since then. But yes, mapping and postmodern geographies, you know, mapping as a kind of a colonial tool, if you like, is something that interests me now. So this is my mapping. Sorry, I'm going off the topic of photograph too. I'll come back to it. So this is my mapping of the observation posts that I found and how I was kind of going to put them into different chapters. So we've got windows that get walked upon, and we've got fish and chip shops, attics, and we've got hospitals, and we've got various different barracks and police stations. What I found was that there were very few on the Protestant side. And I've even drawn, there was one in a bush, covert observation post in a bush, but you know, it's I was struggling to find anything. There's an orange hall with a fake one in there, but really nothing. So, you know, with the current sort of narrative that we've always been given since the ceasefires and since the Belfast Agreement, as you call it, or the Good Friday Agreement, as they call it, everything has two names in Belfast. If you're Catholic, you call it the Good Friday Agreement, and if you're Protestant, you call it the Belfast Agreement. But anyway, you kind of expect this sort of equality of things. So I was quite shocked, and my supervisor was saying, "No, surely that can't be right. You know, you've got to look further. You've got to look harder." I couldn't find any more observation posts. There probably were, but anyway, these are the ones. It was much easier to find these ones, that's for sure. If there were British Army observation posts around here, I couldn't find them, and I did spend a lot of time looking for archives. So, you know, there was an imbalance there. And in the end, my supervisors kept saying, "You've got to do half of your observation posts on the Protestant side." And I'm like, I'm not going to look into a fake observation post or a bush. How can I write about a bush? Anyway, so I ended up, all of the ones I'm doing are on the Catholic side. Okay, so that's photograph one. Photograph two. This RUC station, the RUC is Royal Ulster Constabulary. This RUC station started life as a bland modernist building. A concrete frame structure comprised of in-situ slabs supported by square columns is expressed externally through concrete strips at slab positions on the facade, following the modernist agenda for an honest expression of the structure. Cold bridging becomes a problem in this search for honesty, hinting that functionalism does not function. Story height infill panels of brickwork in stretcher bond continue this agenda by making it absolutely clear that they perform no primary structural function. They are merely a hybrid form of construction consisting of a cavity wall with a hidden blockwork leaf behind. Such hybridity is a characteristic of postmodernism. Punched window openings probably have concealed flat steel lintels in a nod to Mies, perhaps replicating an inherently mannerist dishonesty in modernism itself. In search of a functionalist absence of decoration, a stylistic contrivance is used. It is thus a mere affectation of style, purporting to demonstrate structural engineering integrity, whilst concealing the true structure in line with Mark Wigley's interpretation of Corbusian modernism. The front facade sports a strip of continuous horizontal glazing at ground level. I'll go back to that first one. Where are we? The front facade supports a strip of continuous horizontal glazing at the ground floor level, arrested only to give way to an open entrance where more concrete structure is exposed. Here we glimpse two freestanding square columns, revealed only at the point of entry to the building. The architectural language refers to a modernist institution of the state of only modest significance, with a degree of transparency at street level that its architect must have considered appropriate to the function of a local urban police station built in 1960s Belfast. The modernist architectural agenda has subsequently been subverted. A series of incremental adaptations attest to the increasingly conflicted nature of the architectural programme and its site conditions. Strange openings appear in the brickwork parapet wall, around the size of a parapet drainage gully opening, but no downpipe is provided. I decided to test the possibility that they were formed as gun slots. So I'm talking about these little holes here. A soldier would have had to lie down to use them, and he would therefore be concealed behind and protected by the parapet. And in those days, a soldier was always a man and not a woman. So, aside, I'm an observation post nerd. Well, I've told you that already. I found unofficial gun slots and observation posts. You know, this does not prove that I'm some kind of, conspiracy theorist. I found these things before during my study of observation posts in Nicosia and Berlin. I recognize their shape and location, and I note that they are not visible in the official drawings, models, or replicas of these structures. In Nicosia, the gun slots I found were constructed by the Greek army at night time without permission, with in situ cast concrete wall structures hidden behind more visible and more vulnerable stacks of sandbags. This concealment was to avoid detection by NATO peacekeeping forces that monitored the buffer zone and had banned the construction of any new concrete walls with gun slots at that time. I investigate the architectural appropriation of this modernist building by examining its retrofit facade. The axonometric seems useful, so I should have my axonometric here. Let's see, yeah. It is the architectural tool of choice for many the postmodernist architect. Anyway, I will move on. A series of steel mesh structures have been constructed in front of the original facade, sealing off the entrance. Sorry, where was I? Now, the only way of accessing the building is via steel-clad gates. So that's these ones here. This confounds the modernist architectural expression of an accessible institution of the state. The mesh offers a defensive layer of protection against RPG attack, that's rocket-propelled grenade attack. Steel circular hollow sections secured to the roof support a veil of steel mesh. Cables connect to substantial mass concrete ballasts at ground level. These double up as bollards. So I'm talking about these guys here. Sorry, I've lost it again. Okay, yeah, these double up as bollards, providing protection against vehicular attack to the front of the facade. This is an anti-terrorist tactic in urban street furnishing that originated in Belfast and has become prevalent in an age of global terrorism and its associated Northern Irelandization, or the normalization of extreme security measures in Western cities, particularly since 9/11. Between the layers of mesh, scaffolding, and the brickwork facade, I discover another observation post in concrete block with a metal-clad roof. So that's this one here. The photograph I showed you at the beginning, this is his observation post. Then I find this one here. Viewing slots in the fair-faced concrete walling of the observation posts are mirrored by a series of operable apertures in the mesh screen facade. So this is the gun slot in this one. And you can see that directly in front of it, there is an operable aperture in this mesh screen facade. You don't find them anywhere else, just here. And, you know, there's no, I didn't see any gun slots along here, and therefore I think this, you know, this is about, I reckon, about being able to shoot through the mesh unobstructed. So this mesh here is protecting any of the policemen or the soldiers. But on the other hand, they can still shoot people out in the street from inside it. This would have allowed the occupants more efficiently to view and perhaps more efficiently to aim at their targets. To the right of this observation post, I discern another camouflaged mesh, and behind this second layer of mesh sits yet another observation post. So there's another little sneaky one in here. It's kind of covered in netting. I now review how these photographs support my thesis that this architectural facade offers an early example of postmodern urbanism in its adoption of strategies of visibility, appropriation, and subversion. Visibility and invisibility. A former H Block prisoner explains to us that the British Army occupied the higher ground and looked down at us on the Falls Road. In the first image, the observer performs a role of benign protection or intrusive surveillance in the urban panoptic Foucauldian setting. In the move from overt to covert observation in the 1970s, we encounter the use of false facades, deploying camouflage, decoys, and masks. In this shift, the visibility of observers will be increasingly eroded. Aerial networks of viewing, transport, and communications established earlier were supported by cryptic codes and coded maps, as exemplified in an observation post log from 1972. Now, I think I've got it here, yeah. The final line in the log down here is crucial. I've got 6,000 of these, believe it or not. They're all coded. They don't tell you where it is. It's Cheerful Charlie, Observation Post Cheerful Charlie, Magic Myrtle, and they're all doing their little reports. I love the names, I have to say. Sweet Sue, Apple Crumble. Anyway, the final line in the log refers to a tactical area of command headquarters luncheon in this very building. This tells us that the police station was actually a tactical area of command post and a headquarters of tactical camouflage, concealment, and deception. I now ask, what other architectural material is rendered visible and invisible, and why? The flag in photograph 1 privileges a visual symbolic representation of power and territoriality in the space, intending to serve as a deterrent to any planned disorder while claiming ownership, power, and control over the space. It is an appropriation device. The vehicles parked behind the walls of the RUC station, I'm going to have to show you that. Yeah, so that's the facade we were just looking at was up there. We can see these observation posts on the roof. There's a courtyard here, and then there's all these cars parked in behind. They're rendered invisible to protect their users from car bombs and to keep their registration plates hidden. As like I said, it's very, very important information in those days. 72, it was very important for people not to know your registration plate number. The aerials visible in photograph 2 are testament to invisible aerial infrastructure network of communications between observation positions. Now, I'll go back to number 2. Yeah, the aerials I'm talking about, you've just got to strain your eyes, but you can see them up here. There's a lot of them on the rooftop. They're testament to an invisible aerial infrastructure network of communications between observation positions, both overt and covert. So this is an overt one, but this is a covert. This is where we're just looking at that shift from overt, which is the guy up on the rooftop with the sandbags, and covert. So we're still pretty much in the overt area. Anyway, they were collectively forming an invisible military intelligence infrastructure. The observers offer a human bodily point of contact in the process of production of surveillance logs, where observed elements can be translated into verbal codes and then transmitted elsewhere. Mysterious homely names depict physical spaces: Magic Myrtle, Sweet Sue, Apple Crumble, Cheerful Charlie, Tom Time, and the slightly more ominous Tom Force, which is this one down here. These decoy characters record rioting, ammunition finds, clandestine operations, snatch attempts, provo drinking clubs, sniping, routine searches, a hot pursuit, hits claimed, and mortal woundings in the log. An observation post is compromised and withdrawn, and another observation post, which is covert, is installed at the Sinn Féin headquarters at 51 Falls Road. You can go and visit that. It's got a big mural of Bobby Sands painted on the side of it, just in case you're not sure what their political affiliations are. Observation post logs are a point of reception of verbal codes, simplifying subjects and objects into actions and coded stereotypes to render them visible through language. My next task will be to try to locate them on a map. I'm not going to get into that here. Returning to the second photograph and my analytical drawing, we can discern adaptations to lights and street lights. So here you can see, you know, there's a bulb in that one. There's no bulb in this one. That's no coincidence. But anyway, sorry, I'll go back to there. So there's no illumination here because these guys want to remain in the dark. We can discern adaptation to lights and street lights, rendering some spaces invisible, such as the observation posts, and other spaces highly visible, such as the street. So any civilian walking along here is going to be, well, they're not going to be visible because that street light's been put out, but anyone walking along here is going to be highly visible because they're still illuminated. Lighting arrangements collude with the camouflage netting to conceal the observers behind layers of gossamer darkness. The occupants of the street become transparent subjects in this process of high-intensity surveillance. Hierarchies of visibility are established to reinforce panoptic power relations in the space, constructing a state of visual subjugation of occupants of the street. In an urban spatial reversal of the panopticon, however, it is the observers who are imprisoned by the architecture, while the observed are given the illusion of free movement. In another reversal of visibility, windows have generally been blocked up, while the top hung outward opening windows, so that there you can see the windows that have all been blocked up. And here are the top hung opening windows. On the second floor, permit a soldier to view downwards towards the street while remaining invisible. Now he may be looking, but he may also be shooting, you know, I don't know. Gun slots offer a smaller frame, are more discreet and barely register as apertures. The mesh has a dual function. It provides a robust defense against rocket-propelled grenades. It also provides a layer of camouflage for the observation post. It is equally possible to use these observation posts as a surveillance strip for viewing through binoculars or as a gun slot. This ambiguity reflects an ambiguity in the language around the production of images. Susan Sontag points out how we shoot film in producing it, for example. A similar ambiguity arises when we consider the doubling of windows in the mesh projection. What are they for? Are they for viewing? Are they for shooting? Or are they for escaping? It's this fascinating one here that I'm, you know, if there's a fire, they're in deep trouble. But it's quite a small thing for them to climb out of. Surely a kind of a door would have been better if it was for escaping. Martin J. warns us about the dangers of ocular centrism and the power associated with certain kinds of viewing or scopic regimes. However, this direct danger of viewing and simultaneously shooting is not usually a part of the discourse. The title of the image, figure 4, tells us that the RUC station was heavily fortified, reinforcing a myth or perhaps serving to construct a myth. Yeah, that's this image, the heavily fortified one. An IRA man under arrest is purported to have escaped from this RUC station despite the fortifications, leading to speculation that he was an informer. The police station doubled as a British military headquarters in West Belfast, and the claim that McKee had escaped puzzled his comrades at the time. People were scratching their heads and asking, how did he get out of there? Springfield Road Barracks was considered near escape-proof by IRA activists who had been held there at this time. So at this point, we need to go back to the roof area. The story goes that his impossible escape had proven that he must have been released, thus confirming his status as an informer. To the forensic architect, escape was not completely impossible. The proximity to rear alleyways, so down here, you've got some rear alleyways that go behind, between those houses there, and then there's this street here as well, and then there's a little alleyway there. So the proximity to rear alleyways and the outward-looking observation posts. So all the observation posts are looking outwards. They're looking out towards the street there and there. That might be one there as well, I'm not sure. There was a mesh over this courtyard, which you can't really see in this photograph from 1972. So maybe that mesh wasn't there yet at that point. I do think it's possible that he might have escaped. But anyway, that's another project. Had he found a way to get up and over that wall, which is very, very high. But as you can see, you know, there's a van parked there. Anyway, I don't want to speculate. If he'd been able to get over that 3-story high wall unobserved, I reckon he could have done it, but I'm no expert. In comparing the sequence of photos, we need to consider how power is mobilized in each image, how a particular framing can construct a consensus, and how a dominant worldview can be mobilized to privilege some individuals over others. The aerial view was posted on a website with nationalist sympathies, while the street view was posted by a former member of the parachute regiment. The former alleges that McKee may have been punished or killed by the IRA and uses the image to support their argument that the escape was improbable. So that's this one here of the heavily fortified RUC station. The street view was labelled as heavily fortified, perhaps in an attempt to confirm this assessment. On the appropriation of photographic imagery, in another photograph, figure 11, we see the same RUC station from a different view. So I'm going to go to that one. This one here. What is remarkable here is that the surroundings look very normal. 2 women chat outside a row of brightly coloured shops. It's only the RUC station that is heavily fortified. Despite the boarded up windows to the upper floors, life appears to continue as normal on this street. I'm reminded to treat my drawings and images as critical components of these diffuse networks of power, as forms of propaganda and censorship, and as dissenting views that can break down the constructed consensus of media imagery. I must avoid thinking of drawing as an inert media, offering merely neutral material evidence. Rather, so that's why I don't go in for this forensic architecture business, you know. Rather, like photographs, they are lively, active, narrative representations of events that are mediated, contingent, and unstable. How do we define appropriation? Here I go beyond the postmodern definition of appropriation as an aesthetic posture. I am investigating how the British Army requisitioned public spaces, militarized a corner shop, and turned a street into a battlefield. So that's the corner shop. This used to be a street all the way across here, but now we've got an observation post and your heavily fortified RUC station. An innocuous, modernist, functionist building has been veiled with screening devices and hidden inhabitants. Within the layers, we find hidden figures, a fallen window, and hidden objects. Sorry, I'm going back to this one again now. There's the fallen window. The mesh facade cloaks visibility, suggesting parallel realities or inducing dream states. Scaffolding structures support these cloaks and masks, speaking of ephemerality, architectures under construction, temporary works, all architectural languages of time suspended. The fragmented components operate as Freudian transitional objects, as recognizable objects brought into a surrounding hostile environment. Tactics of camouflage abound. The flag as a territorial marking device is all, more importantly, from a functional perspective, an entire street is appropriated and concealed within the enclosure of the tactical area of command headquarters. Sorry, I've done something weird with my text there. Right. Metal doors to the street, in the tradition of Czech functionalists, operate as eruptions of the political subconscious. The chemist shop next door is incongruous. It is both a neighborhood facility that welcomes customers and therefore functional, but confounded by the dysfunctionality of its blocked corner position. The footpath in front of the RUC station has been removed. The Saracen armoured car has tilt-out windows. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go back to that picture. There's a Saracen armoured car. These are mirrored in what seems to be the architectural expression here of the tilt-out mesh panels. The architecture engages hybrid material objects. These multiple meanings and deceptive elements demonstrate the postmodern characteristics of hybridity, montage, and cross-programming. Wikipedia informs me that the RUC station became a significant centre in the conflict between the military and the British military and the Irish Republican groups. I discover a series of atrocious events in which many people lost their lives or were injured during the lifespan of this building between 1967 and 2003, while many others were tortured and interrogated. After 1972, so this is when we're going into the postmodern dystopian urbanism stage, an IRA rocket attack was launched on the barracks in 1973, injuring 2 people, whilst in 1979 a soldier and a policeman were killed in a machine gun attack. In 1982, a British soldier was killed when an IRA unit fired a rocket at his observation post in the barracks. In 1987, an IRA person was killed in a premature bomb explosion here. A mortar attack was launched in 1987. In 1993, the IRA planted a car bomb outside. The final attack came in 1994 when the base was bombed. It's beyond the scope of my study to explore these events. Rather, I turn my focus to one further event and only to the significance of the architectural event in relation to the facade. I discover that the RUC station was bombed in 1971 and that Sergeant Willits died in the blast. 7 RUC officers, 2 British soldiers, and 18 civilians were injured. A song called The Soldier commemorates his bravery in throwing his body over 2 children while trying to protect them from the bomb. The modernist building provides an ordered backdrop to the military ceremony that marked his funeral. I have to say, this chapter definitely takes more the side. You know, I could have chosen any one of the other observation posts, which are much more contested. Nobody's really contested this one. The other observation posts I've been looking at, you know, it's not always the British Army come out as the heroes in the thing, but in this chapter they certainly do. I discovered that the RUC station was bombed. Oh yeah, I've said that. The modernist building provides an ordered backdrop to the military ceremony that marked his funeral. A procession of vehicles forms a funeral cortege, and the flag-draped coffin signifying the military honours bestowed upon him. So we're talking about the street, spatial semiotics, ritual, ceremony, you know, all the stuff that Venturi, Scott Brown were interested in Las Vegas, if you like. I'm sort of looking at them in Belfast. How these signals and signs are communicated in the urban scenography. RUC officers and members of the army regiment line both sides of the street, while others stand to attention on the rooftop, where 2 earlier observation positions are fully visible. Together, the architecture, vehicles, and people offer an order to the spectacle, mobilizing a ritual of performance, of power and control over the space. The alignment of bodies in the military performance coincides with the alignment of windows and glazing in the architecture. Yet here, the transparency of the architecture is already compromised by the erection of metal hoardings at ground level. So you can see, you know, it's beginning, the modernist order is beginning to be peeled away here. A concrete column in the corner is damaged, revealing that a concrete cladding panel has masked the front of the in situ column. So that's just here. You can see that column's got a cladding panel. The military performance works with the architecture and the urban scenography to construct an image of order, establishing clear hierarchies of space and semantic expression in the dramatic staging of this event. The architectural systems of space, structure, and program are submerged and distorted by an overall symbolic form. As in the Venturi and Scott Brown example, this symbolic architecture is therefore a duck.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? I'm conscious of time, and I was just wondering if, you know, we could allow a bit of time for students to ask questions.
Of course. Yeah. So I'll just read the last bit of Venturi, and then I'll hand over for questions. Will I?
Lovely, lovely.
Lovely. So I'll just read this last bit. I'm sorry I'm going on and on. I'm repeating myself here. So in the 1971 photograph, the building is the sign. It then becomes a decorated shed. Venturi and Scott Brown defined the decorated shed as one where systems of space and structure are directly at the service of program, and ornament is applied independently of them. In the next section, Subversion, I outline how contradictions in form, structure, and program will be constructed in order to falsify the expression of the true function of the facade. And the final act of appropriation In an act of erasure, one of the most significant architectural artifacts of the Troubles, the building was destroyed. The only remaining evidence I found are photographs of it, although there is a painting, which you can see here, where the gateway is described by the artist as a symbolic space, a threshold to a forbidding exterior conflict zone. In Venturi Scott Brown's terms, we may consider this threshold as a duckling in a decorated shed, or consider the ensemble as a decorated duck. The site was subsequently reappropriated as housing, and the RUC station, British Army Barracks, is now completely invisible. Sorry I went on for so long, Nick.
I mean, I could listen all day. Actually, it's just fascinating. But I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Maybe, it would be really nice. I'm sure there are students with a few questions.
Yeah.
Anybody like to just kick off? Anis always has a good question.
Hi.
Hi.
So I did do a little bit of reading. I mean, I like the fact that even though it's not necessarily kind of forensic architecture, what you're doing, and you're kind of trying to find the visible in the invisible, which is actually what I have been trying to do throughout this whole week. Kind of mapping out these old kind of watchful architecture, British Army posts. And and one thing, so this is, if I want to reconfirm, so this is at Springfield Road in Belfast.
Yeah.
So your perimeter specifically, I guess it was the, was there, I'm sorry to repeat the question, but was there a very, very specific reason as to why you chose the Springfield Road and say not where the wall first initially erected, such as Dover Street or in that area?
Well, isn't Dover Street on the Protestant side?
Yes.
Yeah, it's just because, as I said, I couldn't find very many British Army observation posts on the Protestant side. And also, when I was looking through the files in the National Archives, there was very little evidence of any British Army posts there on the Protestant side around Dover Street. I was struggling to find. I had a student spend a year on it even before I got started on it. He couldn't find any over there either. There was one in Flack Street Mill, and there was one on. I've forgotten now the name of the other. There's another RUC. They tended to be, just protecting the RUC stations or the army barracks. So the Flack Street Mill was an army barracks, and then there was another RUC station quite near Dover Street. But yes, Springfield Road is very much, seems to be quite a lot of conflict happening there in the 80s, 90s. It seems to be, the Falls Road is the one that everybody hears about as having been the most conflicted road, but actually Springfield Road seems to have had just as many problems as Falls Road. And it's also the geometry there, isn't it, around that bit? I don't know if that's of any practical use to you. Are you looking at Dover Street in particular?
Yeah, so I was actually looking at, there was a documentary called, I think, Peace Walls and Barricades in 1969 by the BBC, where it was a document showing how they were starting to first erect the peace walls. And it was a contested area in 87 Dover Street, actually. Right now, it's the Dover Millennium Park. So I was just trying to kind of look at, because I'm trying to find the most contested street, which from that documentary, that was literally, it was split in half, and then now it's completely redeveloped and the whole street is completely changed from how the documentary used to be. Like you can see a whole block of flats just completely demolished.
Yeah. Well, I would say, again, it comes back to this thing of double takes, because you're getting your information from BBC. If you looked on RTE, which is the Republic of Irish independent state broadcaster, that would be so the double speak there is you're getting your neutral information from BBC. If you got your neutral information from RTE, they would be telling you, let's say that they'd be talking about Bombay Street. They do. Bombay Street, 1,600 families burnt out of their homes by Protestant, by Protestant mobs after the Civil Rights March. So they would say that was more serious than whatever happened. And Dover Street, there was a bit of a debate because it runs perpendicular, doesn't it, to the Peace Wall. So Cooper Street is another interesting one. I mean, my supervisor is very interested in how Cooper Street becomes the Peace Wall. I would say Cooper Street might be your most appropriate street, because it was actually, there was a fair bit of exchange across Cooper Street in terms of people were friends with each other across Cooper Street and all that before the conflict. And now it is the Peace Wall. There is no street. It's gone. And you'd see in that documentary you were looking at, you can see there's a woman asking the soldier to move the barricade back so that she can be on the, she wants to be on the Protestant side of the barricade, and she's a Protestant trapped on the Catholic side, or vice versa. I can't remember which way it goes. So that it was contested in that way, that people who were alive to speak about it, who were still there, could speak about it. But the 1,600 people that had to flee their homes with their furniture, I would say maybe their situation was worse, because they didn't have a chance to speak about it. They're burnt out. Sorry, now I'm showing my true colors because I grew up in the South.
Maybe I know another student he's really interested in the Divis flats. I was wondering, Satwan, did you have any? Because that's kind of not far from you, is it?
Yeah, it's one of my observation post case studies is in Divis flats, actually.
Ah,
yeah. Yeah, no, it's what would you? I've spent about a year on Divis flats, so it's fascinating.
Asked to unmute.
The caretaker in Divis flats is a really interesting character to speak to if you ever get to go there. There was a few different caretakers, but there's probably different caretakers, but the one I spoke to was fascinating. Noam Chomsky visited Divis flats, for example. I didn't know that. And he tells you all about, now, like, he's actually been contributing to my postmodern take on Divis flats, because the society of the spectacle, and how Noam Chomsky sort of seems to align himself politically with, as Americans do, perhaps not terribly subtly, with the side of the colonized population type of thing, which I think is a lot more complicated than that. But anyway, that's Noam Chomsky, and he's been there twice, actually, to Divis flats. But did you want to ask me about something else?
Satwan.
Sort of. I mean, like, I'm looking a bit into the Divis, and just how, like, the demolition of it, how, like, people it was used as like a memory point, and that it was after it was demolished, sort of, as that the other flats that you showed, that people sort of were able to, like, move on from that point in that certain block itself. Like, there were still contested areas around Belfast with that exact Divis block itself. The demolition of it allowed the people of there to, like, move on, because it was like a stronghold for the people. So yeah, that's just something I'm sort of looking into.
Brilliant. No, I think that's fascinating. And the interesting thing about that I just read recently was that the Irish Prime Minister, Jack Lynch was his name at the time, I remember him well, he actually wanted Divis flats demolished. That's only come out recently. He wanted Divis flats demolished. Down here, I'm in Dublin, in the Republic of Ireland, or as they would say, in the South. In the Catholic side, you say the South, and the Protestant side, you say in the Republic of Ireland. It's a different country. But Jack Lynch wanted them demolished. He was quite keen. Like, they were really in tough straits. Anyone who lived there was caught between a rock and a hard place, because they were denigrated by people who lived in Belfast. They were denigrated by people who lived in West Belfast. Most of the time, they wouldn't even say that they lived in Divis flats. They would say they lived up in West Belfast or near the Falls Road or something like this. But that moment when it was demolished, it was actually, I think, a much better candidate for being the worst housing project. It was considered to be the worst housing project in Europe by photographer Judith Passau, who did a report on it back in 1982, I think it was. And I think it was a better candidate than the flats in Missouri for being the postmodern moment, in terms of when the army moved into Divis Flats and set up their observation post there and so on. But what's interesting when you talk to, I've spoken to 4 different people in Divis Flats who actually lived there. And when you talk to them about it, you know, they get very upset about how things are falsely reported about Divis Flats. In other words, in terms of the geography and the history and so on, it's very much a tourist attraction these days, or before lockdown, you know, before coronavirus, it was very much the tourist attraction. And when you were going on a tour of West Belfast, or of the Shankill Falls Divide, you'd meet at Divis Flats, you'd be taken around. Have you heard about these conflict tours? You get taken from Divis Flats by a former IRA prisoner, and then you get taken over to you spend 1.5 hours on the Catholic side, and then you get taken over to the Protestant side, and you spend 1.5 hours with the Protestant former loyalist prisoner. Now, I would recommend that tour if they run it again, when it kicks off again, I would definitely go on one, because they are really fascinating. But what the locals don't like, the locals hate it, because people who live in the tower say, you know, the tourists are spreading false stories about, you know, Daniel Rooney was killed in the tower, they say, but he wasn't. He was killed in the flats on, you know, he was on St. Brendan's Path. No, he was on, you know, such and such a level. And, you know, there's all sorts of misinformation is being spread around by the former IRA tour guides about the flats, not necessarily as any intentional sort of way of denigrating the people who live there. It was actually just that they don't know, or they read it and they got the facts wrong. So apparently this used to happen as well in Jerusalem. I was quite interested in Jerusalem, you know, to make things more convenient for the tour guides showing you about the history of Jerusalem. They would just shift the Sermon on the Mount to a different mount or whatever, you know, they'd shift historical events into situations that were more easily identifiable with iconographic structures, so for the ease of the tourism. And I think that's happening in Belfast as well. And I think that's very interesting in terms of postmodern geography. So that moment when it was demolished as well, I'd love to know more. I haven't seen a hell of a lot about it, actually.
Thank you, that was helpful.
Any other questions? Anybody else? Francesca, you had a question, I see, earlier on. I think we might be lost. Yeah.
I just wanted to know what the book, the encyclopedia, how to find that.
Oh, the architecture militaire?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually, I don't have the actual book of it. I've just always looked it up on Wikisource, Wikisource, which is the French version of Wikipedia. And his name is Viollet-le-Duc, Viollet, and then LE, and then DUC. And the publication is called Architecture Militaire. So if you Google that, you should be able to find it. I'd be happy to send you the link if you like. I'll make a note to myself and I'll send it to Nick to pass on to you if you like.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Okay, just a sec. Did anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, this is a really good opportunity to, you know, it's such a wealth of knowledge you've brought, Reenie. It's incredible, and a really rich kind of debate you're unpacking. It's you know, I mean, you think ultimately I can see this as a book, you know, as a real kind of part guidebook to these covert sites, but also the whole theoretical underpinning of what you're looking at is it's really relevant to a lot of conversations. And also, you know, you are taking on, your forensic architecture has kind of crowded out this bandwidth, haven't they, a bit with their methods. And I think this is, yeah, really fascinating, actually.
Oh, thank you. I met a bunch of people. I feel bad slagging off forensic architecture because I think what they're doing is really important as well. Yeah. And, you know, it's just in the context of Belfast, it came to me as a kind of a bit of a shock when a group of them arrived from Goldsmiths, and they were a very nice bunch of people, and they'd been studying, you know, it was around about this time, last year or 2 years ago, and they'd been studying Belfast for maybe 3 months, but they decided to set up a mock trial in East Belfast. They set up a mock trial somewhere about the interface there, which is a heavily contested interface. And I felt that was quite arrogant. You know, like I'd been studying this thing in Shankill Falls Divide for 3 years, and I had actually known about it. Probably the first time I went to visit the Falls Road was in the early 80s. And I feel very much like an outsider, and very much like somebody who needs to learn a lot more to understand what the hell is going on there and was going on there. But for these guys to come over from Goldsmiths and decide that they were in a position to do a mock trial, I love the ambition of it. I love the idea that they could feel that they could do that. But at the same time, I think it was perhaps a bit overly ambitious to be. And of course, this is what happens all the time, isn't it? You know, the Hague trials, yeah. When they'll come in and make decisions about things, and it's important, you know, it is important that people get taken to task if they are out of line over things. It's important, but at the same time, I did find it, and I found myself constantly being told by, particularly by one supervisor who's from Peckham as well. I lived in Peckham for 20 years, and he grew up in Peckham. But he'll say to me, you know, "Oh, Reenie, you know, you can't possibly be so judgmental, or you know, you got to be careful not to overstep the line here. You just want to record what you hear, or you know, rather than trying to take sides or what is it? He gets upset because he's just looking at flags, and he's actually a member of the Flags Commission, and he advises the House of Parliament. So it's the nuances that he's always getting me to look at that maybe I wouldn't necessarily always pick up on. It's the little subtleties and the nuances, and it's so easy to. But what he will say to me is, he'll say, you know, you're not the Truth Commissioner for West Belfast, and I was taken down a peg or two, you know, by that. And then when I was in the library, it's always the kind of the female librarians like, why couldn't you have a female Truth Commissioner for West Belfast? You go get him, girl. You can be the Truth Commissioner for West Belfast. So between me and the librarian, we've decided that I'm the Truth. You know, but yeah, I take his point, and you know, we can only ever glimpse when we're looking at history. You know, we can only ever glimpse a little fragment of what actually happened, and there's multiple perspectives on everything. So it's very easy for people to come in to Belfast. I think my supervisor calls it parachute anthropologists. So I'm a parachute anthropologist. I come in for 2 years. Yeah. Think I know it all, and then take off back to the Republic of Ireland. Sorry, I'm rambling on again.
I've got one maybe final question, because we have a day. We're also seeing everybody's work today, so wish we had more time. But a couple of weeks, 2 weeks ago, we had Mark Hackett talking. I don't know if you know him.
Yes.
Yeah, and he's obviously coming from totally different viewpoint. It's like the infrastructure and you know, all of that.
Yeah.
He was saying to the students this kind of. For people living in these areas, it's not that the issue is no longer sectarian. That was his pitch. It's not Protestant Catholic. It's more about inequality and inequalities within Belfast and sort of suburban areas of middle class wealth to the south, and then, you know, these enclaves of poverty and things like that. I mean, do you subscribe to that view, or do you think there's still a residual kind of conflict that defines relationships with people?
Oh, I think it's always there. I've only been learning it since I've been there, because I grew up in Dublin. I grew up in a Protestant community, like Mark Hackett. You know, he's from a Protestant community. I grew up in a Protestant community, and my mother's Catholic and my father's Protestant, but they're both American. So I'm sort of outside of it, really. He's more in, I would take his advice in many ways.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you know, I'm not so sure about, I love the idea that we should be working towards peace all the time. And, you know, I love the idea that we should never say anything to rock the boat. And, you know, people are so careful up there, and it's wonderful. And there's a lot of politeness. And I love the idea that it was more of a, I think Mark's contribution for me, what I learned from Mark was that it was all about class, really, more so than about religion. And I do think it's fabulous the way people are working together now up there to resolve things. But I'm not about that. I'm kind of digging up. I'm annoying. I'm digging up the conflict. I'm wanting to hear about these British Army observation posts. And that does upset people, you know, on both sides, because they just don't want to, they want to bury the past. They want to get ahead with peacekeeping. And like my paper was rejected from the Glen Cree, even in Dublin, you know, which many Protestants in Belfast would assume we're all behind the IRA. It's not at all the case. They're actually much more against the IRA than anyone in England or anyone in Northern Ireland. So I wrote a paper about Divis Flats observation post. It was rejected outright by the Glen Cree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation because it's not conciliatory to study the observation posts or the dividing walls in a lot of ways. And so I think Mark is doing the right thing in kind of trying to suppress all the kind of antagonistic stuff. But at the same time, I don't think I agree with him. You know, the consensus really nowadays amongst academics in Belfast, in the conference I was at, we're talking about Divis Flats, I was at a conference about housing, for example. And the consensus really is anything to do with the Civil Rights Association, whether you're from a Protestant background or a Catholic background, Catholics were discriminated against. You know, they were not given equal access to housing. They were not given, you couldn't have a job in the civil service if you were Catholic terribly easily. You know, even my brothers all emigrated, even though they're from a Protestant background, because they're from the South. They knew that my brother wanted to be a pilot or, you know, work in aeronautical engineering. He knew he'd never get into shorts, into the airline in Belfast, the airplane manufacturers in Belfast, because he wasn't a Northern Irish Protestant. You know, there was terrible discrimination against Catholics in Northern Ireland right up until, and that's what the Civil Rights March was about. I mean, my kind of best example of that would be, they were marching to get a vote. Catholic men did not have a vote in Northern Ireland in 1969, you know, in 1968. So anyway, yeah, I think it is important in terms of post-colonialism, in terms of really understanding and acknowledging that things were wrong in the past, you know, and that equality is really important, and everyone's working towards that, and that's brilliant. But I think Protestants particularly need to acknowledge that there was inequality in order to be able to continue to believe in equality happening in the future, if you like. Because I think it is quite good the way the thing has been set up now in many ways. Sorry, it's a long answer to a short question.
Well, thank you. I mean, thank you on behalf of everybody. It's been really, really great. And I look forward, actually, there's so many things I'd like to carry on discussing with you that you've touched on. And I'm sure, you know, some of the students too. So hopefully we can keep in touch and you know, follow the progress of your research. It's really important for you guys, the students, to see how Reenie's been sharing how the PhD's evolved, how the kind of methodology started, and how the kind of theoretical underpinning she's got for it, behind it, she's built up, and very surprising too to learn that, you know, something on the Shankill Roads is a prime example of postmodernism, and speaks to Venturi and something I think is really stimulating. But also the fact that Reenie's been drawing this, you know, I you know, just keep drawing, Reenie. You know, those drawings of you know, of the observation post and everything are really fabulous, I think, you know, because it takes the conversation right down to, you know, the syntax of architecture, which is semiotics of architecture, which is brilliant.
Thank you so much, Nick. You're very encouraging. I wish my supervisor was as encouraging as you.
Change. Okay. Thank you so much, and we'll
Thank
be
you very
in touch.
much.
Okay,
All
bye.
right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.